Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sound Mind podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of music psychology. I'm your host, Sophia, and as a music psychologist, I'll be guiding you through everything you've ever wondered about music. So, whether you're a music lover or just interested in the science of sound, you're in the right place. So, welcome. And welcome back. I just wanted to say I announced over on our socials, but I've actually decided to change the Soundmind episodes to release every other week instead of weekly. And this just gives me a bit more time to explore bringing on thoughtful guests, which I'd really like to start doing soon, and create episodes that just really feel worth your time. So fear not, you'll still get the same kind of content that you love, just every other Wednesday. But yeah, thank you just so much for listening and supporting. It really means so much to me. It's been an amazing journey so far. We're on episode 32, which is crazy. I started the podcast earlier this year and I'm just so happy with the reception that it's been getting, and all the interactions I have with you guys are absolutely amazing. So thank you so much for being here. So here is your fortnightly episode. So I've actually been moving these past couple of weeks and it's had me on the phone a lot. The bank, my groceries order, insurance, you name it. And a lot of time spent on hold and listening to hold music. And that got me thinking about the music psych of it all. So think about the last time that you were on hold, that endless wait, maybe this tinny saxophone loop, a robotic voice telling you that your call is so important to us. Or maybe it was gentle strings playing in an elevator, filling silence as you're avoiding eye contact with strangers. Well, for most of us, the sounds that play during these moments, they're completely forgettable, even annoying. But here's a twist. They're actually not random. They're carefully designed and engineered to shape how you feel, how you wait, and actually how you behave. So today we're going to be diving into the strange but fascinating world of elevator music, hold music, and the psychology of waiting sounds in general, because here's the paradox. This is all music that's designed to be unnoticed. It isn't meant to grab your attention or stir your emotions, yet it's heard by millions of people literally every single day. It's like the sound of anonymity. And once you start listening closely, I can promise you that you're never going to hear hold music in the same way ever again. So let's start off by rewinding to the 1930s. Picture yourself in a brand new skyscraper, the kind of glittering glass tower that was absolutely redefining skylines across the US. At the time, these high-rise buildings were symbols of progress, but actually riding up them was a brand new experience for most people. Elevators weren't the kind of smooth, quiet machines back then as we know today. They rattled, they whirred, the doors clanged shut, and it's pretty terrifying. I actually have been in a few of these old elevators, especially living in Stockholm in these older buildings, and they're terrifying. I can't imagine going up that many floors in an elevator like that. And for many first-time riders at the time, it was extremely unnerving, even frightening. Imagine just a sudden drop in your stomach, this kind of claustrophobic environment, and also just this brand new awkward silence of being crammed into this metal box with strangers. People were so nervous that some building managers worried that elevators would actually discourage tenants from staying in the building. I've actually declined a few apartments myself after realizing that the elevators in the building were pretty ancient and terrifying, and I pretty much decided that I couldn't do that every day. So I understand, really. But this is where music comes in. So music wasn't just a style of music, it was a company and a brand. Its story begins with Major General George Owen Squire, who was a US Army officer and inventor who had this huge passion for technology. So in 1922, Squire developed a method of transmitting multiple audio signals across electrical wires. And his initial idea was that households might someday receive music directly through their electricity lines, the same way that we got light and power. But by 1934, his system was actually commercialized under the name Muzak, which was actually a word designed to echo the futuristic glamour of Kodak. Pretty cool, actually. And from the beginning, Muzak was marketed as something different from popular music. It wasn't actually about entertainment at all. It was about utility, what the company proudly called functional music. And, okay, what was its function? Well, it was to calm nerves, to ease silence, and create this ambience. And elevators were the perfect testing ground. So instead of listening to this grind of gears and random coughs of strangers, riders were greeted with soft strings, gentle woodwinds, or light jazz arrangements. The music acted as this kind of sonic cushion, smoothing over the unease of this unknown modern technology. It reassured passengers that everything was under control. But Muzak's ambitions didn't actually stop there. By the 1940s, the founders realized that this idea of functional music can actually also be applied to the workplace. So Muzak introduced what it called stimulus progression. And this was presented as a scientific system. Playlists programmed to gradually increase in tempo, brightness, and intensity across a 15-minute cycle before they would actually reset again. And the aim was to subconsciously energize workers, boost morale, and most importantly, increase productivity. Now, I find this absolutely fascinating. This was music psychology in work, back before the field even existed in a more formalized way. It's super, super amazing. So if you were on the assembly line, you might start your morning off with mellow instrumentals. And by late morning, the tempo would subtly rise, keeping your energy up. And after lunch, when workers tended to slow down, the music would shift again to livelier melodies designed to push you past this kind of slump. Muzak claimed that this approach could actually increase output by as much as 25%. Now, whether or not that was true, it almost didn't matter. Businesses loved the promise. Factories installed Muzak systems. Offices piped it into the hallways. Even banks and department stores began using it, hoping that the right soundtrack would not only calm employees, but also put customers in the mood to spend. And during World War II and the Cold War, Muzak even played a role in propaganda and morale boosting. It was broadcast in military factories to keep workers motivated, and in some cases, even used in government films and labeled as the sound of American optimism. But here's an important thing to remember. Muzak was not pop music. You weren't going to hear Frank Sinatra, Elvis, or the Beatles. Lyrics were considered distracting. Strong rhythms were also thought to be disruptive. And emotional ballads, definitely too risky. The whole point was neutrality. Muzak engineered its tracks to be as smooth, inoffensive, and anonymous as possible. And by the 1950s, this sound was everywhere. Hotels, airports, supermarkets, shopping malls, and as it became more common, its reputation began to change. What once felt modern and innovative actually started to feel bland and corporate. People actually began mocking it. Elevator music became this shorthand for anything generic, soulless, or uninspired. It was like this soundtrack that you never really asked for, but you couldn't escape it. And then, in the 1960s, Muzak found a surprising new platform: the telephone. As telephone systems advanced, engineers discovered that they could feed an audio signal directly into the line while callers were placed on hold. Before this, waiting on the phone was frustrating. Silence often made callers feel like they'd been disconnected. We didn't have screens back then that kind of showed this timestamp that you were still on the call. It was way more ambiguous back then. But with music, the line felt alive. The caller knew that they were still connected, even if they weren't yet speaking to a human being. So, of course, they used music. It was already designed to be neutral, repetitive, and probably most importantly, royalty-free. But actually, here's a fun fact. So one of the first instances of hold music, it wasn't actually intentional at all. In New Jersey, a factory owner named Alfred Levy discovered a loose wire in his phone system was actually touching a steel beam. And the beam actually acted like an antenna, accidentally picking up a local radio broadcast. And to his surprise, callers on hold suddenly started hearing music through the phone line. And so instead of fixing this problem, Levy saw this as an opportunity. He patented the idea and hold music was born. I honestly think that's pretty cool. So from elevators to factories, from wartime propaganda to customer service call centers, music had embedded itself into the fabric of modern life. It created a new category of sound, not just for listening, but for waiting, working, and just existing. And its legacy is still with us today. Even now, smooth, instrumental, emotionally neutral music continues to soundtrack the most mundane human experiences. Whether you're rising 30 stories in a lift or stuck listening to this endless loop while waiting for anyone to pick up the phone. So, what is the psychological purpose of waiting music? As it turns out, there's quite a bit of research showing that music doesn't just fill the silence. It actually changes the way that we experience time. So one of the most consistent findings in psychology is that music reduces what's called our perceived waiting time. So in other words, if you're stuck in a queue or on hold for 5 minutes, it often feels shorter when music is playing in the background. And this isn't just a modern marketing trick. Back in the 1980s, researchers were already noticing the effect in everyday contexts. One study found that supermarket shoppers who heard background music consistently underestimated how long they'd been in the store compared to shoppers browsing in silence. And that same time-distorting principle applies when you're on hold with your bank, your internet provider, or the doctor's office. But why does this actually happen? So psychologists often explain it through something called attentional distraction theory. And here's the idea. When you're bored or frustrated, your attention narrows in on the passing of time. So every second feels exaggerated. It's like waiting for a pot of water to boil. But music, however, it fills some of that mental space. It distracts you just enough that you stop counting the seconds. Instead of monitoring the clock in your head, part of your brain is following the melody, predicting the next chord, or maybe even quietly singing along, or loudly singing along. And one thing that always comes to mind for me when I think about this is concerts. You know that pre-waiting time before a concert starts? You're waiting for the support act or the main artist to come on, and yeah, I always just appreciate that the majority of concerts play music during that time because it keeps you occupied. It really stops you from checking every second that's going by. And I've been to a couple of concerts where they didn't play music, and honestly, it was excruciating. So yeah, that's one thing that always comes to mind for me. And there's experimental evidence for this phenomenon as well. So studies comparing silence, music, and periodic announcements show a clear pattern. So in silence, people overestimate how long they've been waiting. With music, they perceive the wait as shorter and less frustrating. And with regular announcements, so I mean those dreaded "your call is important to us" messages, people report the wait as longest of all. And that's because announcements continually remind you that you're still waiting, keeping your attention locked onto time. But music, on the other hand, it gently diverts your focus. But here's the catch. Not all music is created equal. The design choices matter a lot. So take tempo, for example. Faster music tends to create a sense of energy and urgency. Companies sometimes use it to make things feel like they're moving quickly. But there's a risk to this. If the tempo is too fast, it can actually raise your heart rate and increase anxiety. But slower tempos, on the other hand, are generally calming, signaling that it's safe to settle in and relax. So one study that was actually done in dental waiting rooms found that patients who listened to slow, calming music reported both lower anxiety and shorter perceived wait times than those who sat in silence. And then there's mode and key. So a track in a major key tends to feel upbeat, happy, and bright, but a minor key tends to feel a bit more tense or melancholy. And that's why most companies avoid minor key tracks for waiting music, even if they're objectively beautiful pieces of music, because they can unintentionally colour the waiting experience with negativity or this kind of sense of unease. Familiarity is actually another interesting factor here. Hearing a tune that you know, of course, it can be comforting. It gives you something to latch onto. And that kind of moment when you're like, oh, I know this song, it can spark a little flash of recognition and distraction. But it's also risky. Familiar songs come with strong preferences. So imagine being stuck listening to a pop hit that you personally dislike. Or worse, a song that you once loved becomes unbearable after being looped for 15 minutes on hold. Because music taste is so personal, most companies just play it safe with these unoffensive, generic tracks that neither delight or annoy. Risk-free. And then there's the question of repetition. Too much repetition and the track becomes grating. You start noticing the loop point and irritation just sets in. Too much complexity, however, and the music becomes overly engaging, pulling your full attention instead of fading into the background. So the sweet spot is really somewhere in between. Music that's structured enough to occupy your mind, but bland enough not to demand it. Interestingly, this sweet spot reflects a broader psychological principle called the optimal complexity theory of music preference. Essentially, humans like music that's not too simple and not too complex. And waiting music exploits this by sitting right in the middle, engaging enough to distract you, but not so captivating that you'd rather listen than talk to the call center agent when they finally pick up. So if you ever found yourself zoning out to a tinny jazz loop while waiting on hold, it's by design. It's meant to happen. The company is choosing sounds that manipulate your perception of time, nudge your mood in a particular direction, and hopefully make the whole waiting experience just a little bit more bearable. So coming back to this aspect of familiarity, if there's one thing that defines hold music and elevator music, it's this. It's almost always anonymous. Think about it. When was the last time that you heard a pop hit or a recognizable chart song while waiting on hold? I think that almost never happens, and it's deliberate. The vast majority of hold and elevator music avoids lyrics, heavy beats, and strong emotional expression. Because the goal isn't to make you feel something powerful. The goal is to avoid offending, distracting, or polarizing anyone at all. So lyrics are a particularly big risk. Words draw attention, they carry meaning, and they can spark memories or emotions, sometimes in ways that a company can't control. So imagine being stuck on hold with a song about heartbreak while you're trying to complain about your phone bill. It's just not what you need. And that's why most systems opt for instrumentals only. And the same goes for loud percussion or these driving rhythms. Too much energy, like I said, it risks irritation or just making the wait feel more stressful. Instead, hold music is engineered for this neutrality. Smooth jazz saxophones, soft strings, ambient textures that kind of drift without demanding too much of your attention. Musicologists sometimes call this sound functional music, which is coming back to the origins of music. It's music that's designed not for art or expression, but for utility. Actually, I would say lo-fi beats fits into this category. It's music as a tool engineered to influence mood and perception, but in the background. Here's the paradox though. Hold music is designed to be unnoticed, but it's also inescapable. You can't turn it off. You don't get to choose it. You're like a captive listener. And that's the tension. Music that's everywhere, yet designed to disappear. It's why it's often compared to a sonic wallpaper. Like wallpaper, you're not supposed to notice it, but it colours your environment nonetheless. And because it's everywhere, hold music has seeped into culture in super strange ways, actually. Whole corners of the internet are actually devoted to either mocking or celebrating it. So there's been memes about the weirdly generic tinny jazz that feels both familiar and unidentifiable. But sometimes, though, a particular piece breaks through anonymity and becomes almost too famous, like a cultural icon. So British Airways has an infamous use of Vivaldi's Four Seasons in their call centres, and they used this during the 1990s and 2000s. It was on such heavy rotation that it spawned complaints, parody videos, and even academic discussions of how overexposure can turn masterpieces into, like, torture devices. Or there's also this cult fandom that relies around Cisco's hold music. So if you didn't know, Cisco is the world's leading supplier of enterprise phone systems. And that means if you've ever been placed on hold by a bank, a hospital, or a government agency, odds are you've heard Cisco's default track, a 4-minute instrumental composed in the 1980s called Opus Number 1. Originally designed as a royalty-free demo, Opus Number 1 has become unintentionally iconic. Entire YouTube channels are dedicated to looping it, and it's super funny actually. I went through the comment sections and they're filled with nostalgia. It's actually so entertaining to go through and read people's reflections and memories for the track. I think it's like a little community that's been built around bonding on this hold music. I did read something really interesting though. It was an interview with the guy who composed the piece, and turns out he didn't earn any royalties from that track, which is absolutely insane with the amount that it's been featured in different companies. That's such a crazy missed opportunity. And he was also talking about sometimes being on the phone himself and hearing the piece. And because he composed it so long ago, it's kind of like this unintentional throwback that he has to go to, which is kind of a nice surprise, but also kind of jarring to hear. It was a really interesting interview, actually. But overall, I would say that this points to something deeper. For all its anonymity, hold music can leave behind this kind of strange psychological comfort. Because it's so tied to everyday experiences, it becomes a kind of cultural memory. Familiarity just breeds attachment by default. Even though we roll our eyes at yet maybe another jazzy saxophone loop, hearing it years later can really trigger this odd sense of nostalgia. And psychologists would call this a form of associative conditioning. The music itself doesn't mean anything, but over time it gets paired with specific contexts. So elevators, offices, customer service calls. And eventually those associations become ingrained. So when people hear Opus Number 1 or an old music loop, it doesn't just sound like background music to them. It almost sounds like a moment in their life replayed. But for a lot of people, it can also be quite triggering. So while hold music may strive to be faceless and anonymous, it does have a way of sticking around. It's everywhere, it's unavoidable, and it might just linger in your memory long after you've hung up the phone. And it's just this kind of strange power of music that's designed to be forgotten. So, for decades, music was synonymous with blandness, right? The whole point was to fade into the background, to be forgotten. But somewhere along the way, businesses realized something important. Music didn't have to be a neutral wallpaper. It could actually be more part of their identity. And this shift really took hold in the early 2000s when marketing and branding strategies began to embrace what's now called mood branding or sonic branding. So instead of asking what music will annoy the fewest people, companies started asking what music best expresses us. So take Starbucks, for example. In the early 2000s, Starbucks made music a central part of their in-store experience. They didn't just play background tracks. They started curating playlists of indie folk, acoustic, and world music that really fit their brand image of being warm, cultured, and I guess slightly bohemian. They even launched Hear Music in 2007, which is actually their own record label, and started selling CDs in store and partnering with artists. For Starbucks, music became part of the ritual of ordering a latte. It was like this subtle reinforcement of identity. And hotels and airports, they've followed. A luxury hotel chain might lean on chill ambient tracks, soft house, or down-tempo electronic music to create an atmosphere of sophistication. But budget airlines, on the other hand, they might blast upbeat pop at the boarding gate to give off a sense of energy and fun. Do you know who I'm talking about? You know what I'm about to say? Jess Glynne and Nothing Beats a Jet 2 Holiday. It's etched in our minds. I know at this point. I hope that you get the reference. If not, you've probably been living under a rock. But in both cases, the soundtrack becomes an extension of the band's personality. I remember when I used to live in the UK and getting on a Jet2 flight, just hearing the Jess Glynne song every single time you're boarding. It was just part of the experience. That was how you knew that you were going on holiday. It's there to hype you up, as annoying as it gets when it's on loop. And I kind of feel sorry for her having that association with her music now. But it's a choice. It's a choice, I guess. But streaming services overall, they've really supercharged this trend. Companies no longer need to rely on stock libraries or licensing. With services like Apple Music for Business and companies like Soundtrack Your Brand, which used to be Spotify Business, businesses can now subscribe to curated playlists tailored to their needs and pay the proper royalties for using them in public spaces. And this has turned background music into a super flexible, actually data-driven tool. Playlists can change by time of day, also match seasonal campaigns, and even adjust to the pace of traffic in your store. And research backs up why this works. Studies in consumer behavior consistently show that background music influences how customers perceive a space. So one actually really fun study found that when French music played in a wine shop, French wines outsold German ones. And when German music played, the opposite happened. Super cool. Also crazy that shoppers weren't even consciously aware of the influence. And that's the power of what's known as atmospheric congruence. The music basically primes you to experience the brand in a certain way. So today, instead of faceless music, in a lot of our daily instances, we get curated soundscapes. Coffee shops use mellow indie playlists. fashion retailers are pumping out trendy beats, and airports might balance ambient calm with announcements, of course. But even hospitals are experimenting with sound design to create a less stressful environment. I think the old elevator music has been rebranded into a whole industry of audio strategy. What was once a synonym for blandness is now a carefully curated tool for storytelling. Bland has become branded. And the chances are, the next time you're sipping coffee in a cafe or wandering through a clothing store, you're not just hearing background music, you're hearing a company's identity just set to a soundtrack. Now, I do want to step back and kind of ask a bigger question. What is the real purpose of hold music? Is it there to soothe you, or is it there to keep you pacified just long enough that you don't hang up? And I think this is where the ethics of waiting music really get interesting. So, on one hand, music can genuinely reduce stress. So, studies on waiting environments, whether in hospitals, airports, or call centers, show that calming background music lowers reported frustration and in some cases even reduces physiological markers of stress like elevated heart rate. So in that sense, hold music feels like a small kindness, something to make a dull or annoying experience feel a little bit more bearable, right? And hospitals, dental offices, and clinics have actually long experimented with background music not just to fill silence, but directly reduce patient anxiety. Waiting for surgery, test results, or even routine procedures can really spike stress hormones like cortisol, raise your blood pressure, and just overall make people more tense, all of which can actually affect outcomes. And studies are consistently showing its power. So one meta-analysis actually showed that music played before surgery significantly reduced patients' self-reported anxiety compared to silence. And another study even found that listening to calming music before surgery was actually as effective as a sedative drug in lowering stress and other physiological markers. And it comes without side effects. So I think that's pretty amazing. So how does it work? Essentially, similar to hold music principles, it's all about attentional distraction. Music fills a cognitive space that would otherwise be occupied by worry. And there's also a physiological effect as well. Slow tempos, consonant harmonies, and soft instrumental timbres like piano, strings, and gentle ambient textures, they can slow heart rate and also encourage deeper breathing. Some hospitals even integrate nature-inspired soundscapes as well, like flowing water or birdsong, creating this subtle sense of restoration. So in these settings, music is intentionally therapeutic, right? It's designed to respect the listener's well-being while they wait. But contrast that with corporate hold music. From a business perspective, music often exists to keep you on the line. Happier sounding customers are less likely to hang up, which lowers call abandonment rates and, of course, keeps potential sales flowing. The same attentional distraction that reduces anxiety in hospitals can be repurposed to manipulate frustration tolerance in customer service lines. The ethical difference comes down to intention. So is the music serving the listener or the company? Of course, not all companies are getting it right either. Sometimes the choice of hold music makes things a lot worse. Think of distorted audio that crackles through the line, or the same 20-second loop playing endlessly until it burrows into your brain as an earworm. So research in auditory perception actually shows that poor sound quality by itself actually increases cognitive load. So in other words, your brain has to work harder to process the music, which makes waiting even more exhausting, as if it could get any worse. And mismatched mood is also another common mistake. So imagine calling your insurance company after a car accident and being forced to listen to an upbeat salsa track. or calling the hospital and getting techno. When the tone of music clashes with the emotional state of the caller, it can feel tone deaf, for a lack of better words, or even disrespectful. One study on service environments found that congruence between customer mood and background music was key to reducing frustration. So, in other words, if you get the vibe wrong, you're making things worse, not better. But there are success stories as well. Some companies have begun experimenting with more humanized touches, so rotating playlists so you don't hear the same track in every call. Or putting nature sounds in between bits of music, so having that rather than these robotic announcements. A few even use silence deliberately, recognizing that for some customers, a calm pause is actually less irritating than endless loops of cheap MIDI jazz. And one clever approach is contextual music design. For example, certain airlines and luxury hotels now license high-quality instrumental tracks specifically chosen to match their brand identity. Others use dynamic systems that change tempo or mood based on the estimated wait times. So, slower, soothing tracks for longer waits and lighter, more energetic tracks if you're just about to be connected. These tweaks acknowledge that music isn't just filler, it's really a key part of the customer experience. But at the heart of it, the ethical dilemma is this. Are companies really using music to respect the customer's time, or are they just using it to strategically mark the reality that they're waiting just way too long? The difference between soothing and manipulation can be subtle, but I think it's important. Done right, hold music can really just make the waiting process a little bit more humane. But done wrong, and it becomes yet another reason for us as customers to roll our eyes, or maybe even just hang up. Now, I want to finish off today's episode by touching on a question around the future of waiting music. So here it is. With phones in our pockets these days and having Spotify at our fingertips and customer service is moving more online, do we even need waiting music anymore? Take elevators, for example. So for most of the 20th century, they were the birthplace and the punchline of background music. But step into a modern lift today, and the chances are that you probably won't hear anything at all. My hunch is that elevators have largely lost their soundtracks because the mechanical clutter that once unnerved us as passengers has been replaced by these whisper, quiet systems. People no longer need music to distract them, and also because they're already staring down at their phones. In fact, I actually wonder and doubt whether the next generation will even understand what elevator music even means. It's on its way to becoming like a cultural relic. But what about hold music? Will it go away the same way or evolve into something new? So I think that one possibility is AI-generated music. So instead of looping the same saxophone track, companies could generate endless variations of calming ambient sounds tailored to the situation. Imagine, if your estimated wait is short, you might get light, upbeat music that feels like you're moving quickly. Like I mentioned, some companies are already doing, but this could be done with AI tools that can compose in real time. And that means that the music never actually has to repeat, which I think solves one of the most annoying aspects of hold music today. It could be a pretty interesting possibility. I think there's a future where waiting also becomes interactive. I'm not really sure if this exists at all already, so let me know if you've ever experienced anything like this, but instead of passively listening, you could potentially choose, let's say, press 1 for jazz, 2 for classical, and 3 for ambient. So one study actually found that perceived control during waiting is actually a huge factor in reducing frustration. So giving callers even a small choice over their soundscape could transform hold music from irritating filler into this personalized experience. But maybe the real future isn't more music, it's less. Some companies are already experimenting with alternatives like short podcasts, trivia questions, or snippets of useful information instead of music. And like I mentioned, others have switched to silence altogether, betting that customers would rather listen to their own playlists than endure yet another tinny loop. And then, of course, there's the bigger question. Will future generations even encounter hold music at all? With customer service increasingly moving to live chat, messaging apps, and even AI-driven bots, the waiting on hold experience may become obsolete. If a chatbot can resolve your problem almost instantly, there's no need to pipe in music to distract you. Hold music may end up like dial-up internet sounds, a once ubiquitous part of modern life that quietly vanishes into nostalgia. Still, I personally think there's a strange resilience to hold music. Even if AI or chat replaces phone cues, I think there'll always be moments in daily life where we have to wait. In airports, in hospitals, at stations. And history shows that wherever there's waiting, someone will try to fill the silence. Whether that's through AI-generated loops, curated playlists, or who knows, holographic distractions, the spirit of music may survive in new forms. So maybe the future isn't the death of hold music necessarily, but its transformation. From elevators to call centers to AI landscapes, the soundtrack of waiting is just evolving. But that brings us to the end of today's episode. I think it's such interesting stuff. I love when something that we don't give much thought to turns out to be something so thought-provoking and interesting. There really is science behind everything. And, well, music psychology is everywhere. Like I said, it's awesome to see its existence way before it even really existed as a field. So, yeah, super interesting stuff. Thank you so much for joining me today on The Sound Mind. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate or review on wherever you're listening and share it with someone who loves music just as much as you do. Don't forget to follow us and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And also come and say hi over on Instagram and on Threads. I absolutely love having such thought-provoking and interesting discussions with you all over there. So if you want more music psych insights in between episodes, come and say hi over there. But until next time, keep listening, keep reflecting, and I'll see you on The Sound Mind.